Thank you very much, Herman. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, today I'd like to share with you some reflections based on my activities as a scholar and a textual editor. While my first-hand experience, as you've heard, is largely in the field of medieval studies, and my comments will therefore be coming from that viewpoint, I hope that the insights, conclusions and suggestions will be relevant for other contexts and periods and for those working with different kinds of primary materials. Okay, I'll center my talk around the three keywords in the title: possibilities, choices and interpretations, because I think they are sort of key factors, the key aspects in any kind of editorial activity. And the first keyword featured, of course, in the call for papers. I'll come to the others in a minute, but first I'd like to reflect a bit more on the conference title, and especially on the second part of it, the historical and literary paradigms in source editing. Now, why should text editors in these different fields and different subjects be talking to each other in the first place about the foundations of their practice? When I received the invitation to speak at the call for papers, I was intrigued by the bold statement of the conference organizers, who made it their explicit aim that practitioners in these fields should indeed be striving, as it said, striving for a common approach in their editorial practice. And while this statement is possibly not entirely controversial on this platform, I started to wonder why this should be the case. Why should we indeed strive to for a common approach? Why should we not all do our own thing for our own subject field? And I think there are a number of good reasons for this, and I think first of all I'd like to reflect a bit on these, because it is important, I think, to be aware of them during our discussions at the conference. Now, the first set of reasons is linked to what I'd call the kind of postmodern academic world in which we all work. Historical studies, literary studies are no longer the monolithic disciplines that they used to be. Scholarship and research in the humanities now present a range of academic practices informed by a growing number of methodological approaches, critical approaches, theoretical frameworks, from gender studies to book history, from archaeological fieldwork to participatory observation, from hieroglyphs to popular music. The humanities is a broad church which encompasses a large number of fields and critical theories. Now, this realignment, if you will, of traditional disciplines, which started when humanities scholars got interested in multidisciplinary research, is now also clearly spreading to other aspects of the academy. At my institution, for example, students studying a single subject during their undergraduate degree course are in a minority, and current plans for curriculum reform are clearly aimed to reduce that number even further, so that most students will graduate having studied in all their years of study at university at least 2 subjects. Now, of course, American universities have done this for a long time, but I think Europe is going to follow suit. And it's not just going to be teaching in which this is confined. Also, organizational reforms and changes in terms of funding are affecting this, I think. And again, looking at my institution or other institutions in the UK, organizational reforms are realigning these traditional departments. We are being joined up with other cognate fields, or fields which are seen to be cognate by vice-chancellors. Also, research councils like the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK are increasingly looking for large-scale multidisciplinary projects as the kind of research activity they want to support. And all these changes, I think, will, if increasingly redraw the boundaries between traditional disciplines. And that, of course, I think, means that it makes perfect sense that we as editors, historical or literary scholars, talk to each other about editorial practice, because our editions will have to serve these kinds of newly configured disciplinary fields. Now, a second set of reasons, I think, which have influenced this idea that cross-fertilization and historical literary editing of historical and literary editing would be a good idea is not so much this kind of postmodern world, but something that's decidedly modern. And here I'm touching upon, probably for the first time, on the word possibilities. As was stated in the call for papers, the development of editorial practice in recent decades has received an enormous stimulus from the technical possibilities of the application of information technology to the practice of source editing, and we've heard this already a number of times by previous speakers and previous presentations. Developments in terms of increased capacity of modern computers in terms of storage, memory, processor speed, connectivity, the internet, especially the World Wide Web and the different devices, as Manfred has reminded us yesterday, increased diversity of devices which are connected or connecting to the World Wide Web, artificial intelligence in the widest sense of the word, that is, computers are now increasingly able to cope better with fuzziness and with natural language, and then certain developments in technology, in particular the development, but especially the wide acceptance of XML. All these developments together have had an enormous impact and have expanded the possibilities for us as editor, to such an extent that it's now, I think, very easy to think that anything an editor wants to do is technically possible. And I think there was certainly, we've heard already a bit of this enthusiasm that technically we are at a point where most of the things we want to do, we can do. And I'd like to temper that a bit later on in my talk. Technical developments have certainly made it possible to edit many more documents, to include many more materials than could be included in, say, traditional printed editions. For example, transcriptions of all the witnesses or all the variants, rather than a selection of these, as is often or usually the case in printed editions. These digital editions have also made it possible to provide a plurality of editions all in one, each of these potential incarnations of an edition corresponding to a different critical framework, and that is generally seen as a great advantage, because for several reasons. One is that it sort of brings out into the open much more clearly the part of the editor, what he brings to his source when he establishes the edition, and this transparency, the difference between the source as it is and what the editor does with it. This is achieved by a clearer separation of the primary materials on which the edition is based and the critical or interpretative layer or layers added to it by editors. Now this makes users of the editions more aware of these different moments in the genesis of the edition. It also, and more importantly, allows users to retrace the editor's steps and to negotiate an alternative interpretative route through the primary materials if a particular user is not entirely satisfied by decisions made by an editor. He or she has also access to the primary materials, and therefore can do a bit of the editorial work himself or herself using those materials made available. And then, therefore, editions become much more interactive, allow users to play a more active part, rather than be the simple recipients. This is that the Chronicle has not survived in a single authorial version, but rather in a whole series of different redactions or versions, some of which are probably authorial and others more likely to be the result of scribal activity. The relationship between all these different witnesses and versions of the text, while having been studied for a century and a half, have not been satisfactorily charted and understood. So there is not a sort of a commonly accepted view of how all these versions relate to each other, which is why it is important that scholars can access all these versions. The critique genetique is therefore an aspect that is central to any literary or historiographical or historical analysis of the work. Traditional printed editions, while they of course have to address this issue, they have not been very successful at all in making this body of variant readings available in a usable and useful format, because they had, of course, to be very selective indeed on the variants they could include, the material they could include, and also because each of them had to take a particular point of view and interpretation of the textual development, and then present all the material according to that particular interpretative framework. I'm just going to try and show you a bit about how the edition worked. The central aspect is the text transcriptions. And they are called up here. This is the list of all the manuscripts of books 1, 2, 3, and 4. 1, 2, and 3 that are currently available. Well, this one you can sort of see. That is the primary presentation. It imitates the manuscript layout. It has some links explaining names, explaining persons, places. Tools to navigate. Folios, manuscript chapters. This is a chapter of the canonical edition, the reference edition. You may ask, what is this big white cap? There is a miniature there, which you can call up with some description analysis of that image. Now, and one has the reproduction on the other side, which can be shown and hidden, or the transcription can be hidden. You have a number of footnotes, annotation, useful for literary or historical scholars, and so on. I mean, this is the kind of thing we are expecting from a digital edition. Of course, there are other aspects. Searching becomes very easy, or much easier than with a printed edition. The annotation, the kind of annotation which I showed you, of course, the great advantage of this kind of approach is that the annotation can be accessed at each and every point where it is relevant. So there is a note on Jean Froissart here, the author of the Chronicler. As you can imagine, he's mentioned more than once. In a printed edition, you could have only one footnote. Here we can have this, we can display the same note at each and every occurrence of the name Jean Froissart. We've also have an English translation of this text as well. Okay, so that's the edition I've been working on, and which has given me a number of insights and experiences in the problems of faced by editors using this approach. Now, it's very easy to be optimistic about this and about all the possibilities and everything that is that can be achieved. So, does that mean we've cracked it? Can we now do everything we want to do? Can we now both take left and right? Do we not have to choose at all? We can just serve any constituency, any number of disciplines and critical approaches can just consult a single edition. Can we have our cake and eat it? Well, you could say, yes, we can, using these or combining these two approaches which I outlined before. But actually, I think, speaking from my own experience, no, not quite, I think, for a number of reasons. And I'd like to reflect a bit more on these. And the first set of reasons are what I call external societal factors. Time in academia is a precious resource, as we all know, and producing editions requires a lot of time and a lot of resources. It's no news to you if I tell you that academic research is increasingly being instrumentalized, that research funding decisions are increasingly based on projected results, and that these results are then judged on their perceived usefulness. And in humanities, certainly in the UK, usefulness is increasingly interpreted as usefulness for wider society. And that means, although that technically it may be possible to cater for a very wide range of potential users and therefore present a very wide range of aspects of the original source to cater for many different kinds of potential end users of the edition. In practice, I think it would be very difficult to obtain the funding for this activity without providing clear rationales for doing indeed everything one could possibly do. Having a handful of users who may be interested in a particular feature does not justify spending a large amount of resources or a large amount of money creating this edition. And just to give you an example, from my personal experience, I was discussing the online FOSSA with a colleague in Lyon, and this colleague is very interested. He's an historical linguist. He's very interested in punctuation. You may have seen we've decided to standardize the punctuation as a modern critical editor would do. So we decided very consciously not to represent that aspect of the manuscript. Although technically it's perfectly well possible to do it, we decided that we wouldn't do it. We also decided that we would not. That we would silently expand all the abbreviations. Again, technically it's very well possible to encode the abbreviations, but we just calculated how much, and it would sort of really double the time it would take to make the transcriptions. And we would then be able to cater for my colleague and a handful of other people who would be interested in this. And then he'd written a doctorate on punctuation in Middle French, and he's looked at FOSSA and he transcribed and encoded in TEI very carefully the punctuation of one manuscript, one page of one manuscript, and the rest of his corpus was, I think, 30 or 35 other pages. We are editing, we have currently more than 16,000 pages. The amount of time and effort it would cost us to do this would just not be justifiable. So I think we always have to think very carefully, not just about what is technically possible, but what is justifiable in terms of views of a source. Too many possible interpretative frameworks. I think it is, in my view, impossible for one editor or one team of editors to anticipate all of these and to cater for them. That's, in my view, a fallacy. There are certain aspects which we can easily do. There are other aspects which are much more difficult to do. It's very easy to be optimistic about how much we can achieve, but I think ultimately this kind of aim will be defeated. It is possible to cater for more than one discipline, and indeed we should achieve to do that, and for as many as possible, but not go to extraordinary lengths to do so. I think there is a balance to be struck. But even, I think there is a third set of reasons which are technological, and I think, and here I'd like to sort of dampen the enthusiasm a bit. Even if we from a scholarly point of view, we could anticipate all the critical frameworks or kinds of investigation. I think we are currently still limited by technology. The current technology, in my view, is simply not is not suitable for implementing an endless series of alternative views of a source, of endless series of additional layers, layer upon layer based on this bottom layer of the representation of the source. Again, referring back to the spec of yesterday. And the reason is that most computer-supported editorial practice, and indeed the practice we've adopted, is heavily based on XML technology, and in particular on the community of practice centered around TEI. And the TEI provides a very powerful framework for encoding a source-focused representation of a text, but it's far less suitable, I think, to build an endless series of layers upon this. And that is because at a deeply fundamental level it's bound to XML, and therefore bound to the concept of nested hierarchies inherent in the XML model. Now, if one starts adding different views, different interpretations, different layers on the material, the more one does that, the more one increases the chances that the XML structures will not nest properly anymore. And we've certainly run into that problem with the FOSSA. Each additional aspect added to the encoding has also an exponential effect on the complexity of the processing of XML for visualization and searching. So this image of the layered cake is not actually correct. These layers in an XML document, it's quite complex to single out these individual layers. They're not independent, they're all meshed together. And we've come up to that problem in the online FOSSA, for example, in relation to critical markup to do with critical annotation that interferes with codicological markup, or that interferes with the linguistic markup. Linguistic markup are the links we provide to the online Dictionnaire du Moyen Français, or that then interferes with the name markup, which forms the basis of the historical annotation, which you've seen. So in a case where there is an editorial emendation that has to be made, that spans 2 or 3 names, and you've got a line break or a page break in between, it's still possible, but it becomes very, very complex to make sure that the style sheets and the other processes to visualize these things work properly. And each additional element which is added to the interpretive layers just makes this exponentially more difficult. And as I said, it's possible to come up with solutions for many of these problems, but there comes a point, I feel, where the complexity becomes such that one just has to stand back and ask whether it is really working, whether XML technology is indeed ultimately suitable for this kind of approach. And I don't think it is. Standoff markup may be an alternative, but in its current form, it doesn't present a very elegant or a very scalable solution, I think. And what we as editors need, and I don't think we will be able to develop it, but it's a solution, a technological, robust solution which natively supports multiple hierarchies. So XML2 or something else, I don't know, but XML, I think we are really pushing at the limits here. The second issue I'd like to mention is to do with longevity or durability of our editions, and again something which we've heard about before, and therefore so we are, I think, increasingly aware of this, which is why the community has been developing standards and trying to adhere to standards such as TI, which have increased the possibility, I think, they have increased more the possibility of exchange than the durability or the longevity. It's much more possible to exchange your XML data with somebody else using TI as well. I'm not convinced that if in 20 years' time somebody will dig up our transcription files, how useful they will be. And just to sort of refer back to my own experience, when I started on my PhD, I decided that Manfred's Clio system was the best system at the time, which allowed me to store, analyze, process the 17,000 or so charters I was looking at for my PhD, much more than the relational database or the spreadsheet. And I think that was the right decision at the time, but if from time to time I'm being asked to write something using that material, and I have to dig up an old laptop with Windows NT and then try to remember the command language for Clio. I've got another old system, a MacBook running 9.1, because that's the system which allows Peter Robinson's Collate system. Now, you may think, well, maybe I made the wrong choice. I should have decided to go for TI, and I suppose I could have, because I remember the first conference I went to in my first year in graduate school. There was a paper by Lou Bernard. He gave a presentation on some kind of markup system, which he assured us was going to solve many of the problems we were having in marking up text, and that, of course, was TI in the very early stages. Problem was, there was absolutely no software I had access to which could do anything with these files at all. And even if I had access to that software, those files would have been encoded in HTML using DTDs, which most of the current software solutions don't understand anymore. So I think it's a bit of a fallacy to think that adhering to a standard such as DI would ensure longevity over the medium to long term. It will not, I think. And there is a further aspect to this, is that, well, we know how, I think we're better aware of how to keep such files alive. We know about backing up, archiving, renewing digital data, using Unicode. That certainly holds the promise for the medium term, if not the longer term, in terms of character encoding. A more difficult problem, and I'm not sure how aware we are of this, is that a lot of, even if we use, say, TI or another standard, still a lot of the knowledge of that's encoded in the TI is not in the actual file, but in the environment. That is, the programs, the scripts we use to analyze them, to manipulate them, and also the project-specific know-how. So what does that mean? Well, I think it means that, referring back to the spec hook, the more layers we have to our spec hook, therefore the more useful it is, because we will be able to represent more views, we will be able to serve more constituencies, more disciplines, and so on. But also, the more complex the whole thing becomes, and therefore the less likely it will remain usable in the future. Solutions to offer for this without the original context, that is the editorial know-how, the digital tools to manipulate these files, they will become much less useful in the future. What to do then? Should we just retreat from adding these interpretive layers, not make choices, just trying to represent our sources as faithfully as possible using appropriate standards such as DEI? I think it would be admitting defeat to a large extent all the advances that have been made in recent decades. It also, I think, is problematic for another reason. Shirking away from making choices means that as editors we are in danger of fetishizing the source or our edition. It's very easy to become obsessed by intricate and possibly or potentially interesting details of the primary material, and then try to replicate the experience of studying these in a virtual environment. But I think it is good as an editor to be forced to apply a certain interpretative paradigm to one's source, the source one is editing, and therefore introduce extraneous elements to the source, because in my experience that always improves the source. Lemmatizing our text brings out transcription errors, having to identify names and places brings up textual problematic areas and variants that would otherwise not have been obvious if we just focus on the manuscript and trying to represent the manuscript as it is. Now, to conclude, how do I see editorial practice evolving in the coming decades? I think TI will continue to play